about the purposes the communists had with regard to Sputnik, putting Sputnik in the air. And before we get to summarizing that or winding that part up, we're going to come to, I'm going to take time for one other digression, the point I want to make. We're talking about Russian military might, the threat thereof, the way it has been used to distract people's minds from the real threat of internal subversion. I'd like to point out another reason why there is no chance on earth of an honest outside war, if you can call any war honest, an actual, plain, ordinary, honest war between the United States and Soviet Russia, or East and West. It's as ridiculous a fancy as you can possibly think of. It doesn't mean that when they get far enough and are taking us over anyway, and can get their hands on our materials or so forth and complete open control of both, that they won't start dropping atom bombs on our cities if they want to destroy one to terrorize the others, or won't do all kinds of things. But for an honest, actual test of force, of military might, an honest war between the two, nothing could be more impossible. Now, I'll tell you, among many reasons, the controlling reason why. The students of the conspiracy who've given it any real attention at all are all aware of the tremendous extent to which the communists use the old theme of divide and conquer. It goes way back, of course, to the Greek world before, old as history. But most of them have not stopped to consider the extent to which the communists have used a projection of them, which, as they have taken over more and more of the world as already theirs, has become even more important to them. And that is divide and keep conquered. All of these nations they've taken over that are behind the Iron Curtain or under their control or as dependencies, they have to hold them that way. They have to keep their opposition divided. Once they've taken over, they kill off and squelch enough of it. It's not quite as dangerous, or quite as bad as before, but they still are sitting on a powder keg all of the time. And as a very important part of this strategy of divide and keep conquered, the communists foment one revolt after another all over the world in order to kill off their opposition at a time when it's most convenient to themselves, or when it's safest for themselves, and in a way that will serve their purposes best. Most of the revolts you have seen since 1946, 45 and 6 in communist countries, in dependencies and satellites, have been promoted by the communists themselves for this reason. Now, in 1956, when the Poznan riots broke out, my wife and I were just leaving for Europe. I had resigned my job, was starting to work on full lifetime on this battle, but had not settled down so completely yet, and decided we better get a vacation in. But I was publishing this little one man's opinion. And we had put the magazine to bed and sent it to the printer. We were leaving for Europe in just a day or two when the Poznan riots broke out. And I said, look, hold everything. I got hold of the printer and stopped the magazine, and we wrote 4 pages, which we substituted in place of something else, in which we pointed out that beyond any question, these riots in Poland, this insurrection, had been promoted by, fomented by, instigated by the communists for their own purposes. And what was starting in Warsaw, the same thing. And what's more, by the time I'm finishing writing it, things moved pretty fast there. There were rumblings of the Hungarian revolt coming. And we said that if the Hungarian revolt really breaks out, the same thing is absolutely true. It's being precipitated by the communists for their purposes, to serve their purposes. And they will have a little more trouble with it in a way, but will have no real difficulty in squelching it whenever they want to do so. Well, of course, we were ridiculed about it, as we were when we pointed out that Tito had not broken, was still a communist. And we pointed out that Sukarno was not the George Washington of Indonesia, as Mr. Richard Nixon told both houses of our Congress he was, 1956, but was a communist murderer who'd always hated the United States, and as we were when we said Castro was a communist in 58 and so forth. And we were terribly ridiculed over this saying that the Hungarians and the Poles both had been instigated into this revolt by the communists. But it was only a few months later before we were able to publish, right in One Man's Opinion, the same magazine, a brief article by Michalajczyk, the former premier of Poland, in which he said identically the same thing. And what a tragedy it was that the Polish resistance, the underground resistance to communism, had been lured out prematurely by this precipitated revolt and destroyed at a time when they could accomplish nothing and had given their lives for nothing at all. That was with regard to the Polish part, the Poznan-Warsaw riots. With regard to the Hungarian, we never had any way of getting any such official backing. But the story became completely clear in due course to anybody who would really look at it and study it. In the first place, the Hungarian revolt served not one but many communist purposes and served it very, very well. One incidental one that I'll forget presently was it was timed to be exactly simultaneous with the Suez crisis. And that they used both of those things back and forth to get the Americans' minds, and English minds too, off of one while thinking about the other, depending on which way they wanted. For several weeks there, your attention was tossed back and forth between the two, both going on at identically the same time. But there was one American reporter, a man named Johnson, who stayed through the whole thing. And he came back to this country afterwards and he tried to tell about it. He got one article, he wrote several articles. He got one in one edition of some afternoon newspapers. That frequently happens. They have guards, they have people everywhere to pull them out. Maybe a rewrite man, maybe a layout man who does the headlines, maybe the editor himself, but they are pretty well covered today. But still, something will come in as a news item and go through in the regular way, and the percentage that they've got is still very small in the whole communications media. So something will get in, and then, of course, somebody who's the proper man, the agent, catches it and gets it out. When Sputnik went up, for instance, there were two different American brigadier generals, independently, that issued statements and said, what the heck is all the excitement about? We were able to put a Sputnik into the air 15 months ago, perfectly ready to go. And we were stopped by Washington from doing so, and it's obvious now we were stopped in order to let the communists go first. And why all the noise about it? That got into one edition, as far as I know, and was got out at once. To go back to the man named Johnson, this man came back, wrote some articles, and at least one of them got into one afternoon edition. I have it somewhere in my files. There's all these things in the thousands of folders. We have it all right. In which he pointed out that not only did the communists in Moscow plan the Hungarian revolt, foment it and precipitate it, but that they had put their tanks at the proper distances and the proper places around Budapest before they ever precipitated the revolt to be sure to be in position to squash it whenever they wanted to do so. This was right in these articles. Well, the thing to look at is what was accomplished by the revolt. This was one of the, almost as much as Sputnik, one of the most tremendous advances the communists ever made was the Hungarian revolt, for a number of reasons. In the first place, the revolt was promoted, led by some very heroic youngsters, college freshmen, high school seniors, college sophomores. You remember the young hero freedom fighters in Budapest. A lot of the old people came into it, but they were the ones that sparked it, set it off. Let's jump to the most important single thing first. As the revolt got underway, there was a tremendous flood of anti-communist refugees across the border into the Austrian refugee camps. And we immediately began to glorify them and bring them over here. Now, refugees from communism had been pouring across that rice field. You can see from the hill there in Hong Kong. You can look right down at the communist workers in the rice field. They've been pouring across there for years under tremendous danger and loss of life and horrors and cruelty. We'd never paid the slightest attention to it. All over the world, refugees from communism had been crawling under barbed wires and creeping through holes to get out. We never paid any attention at all. But, oh my goodness, the minute all of these refugees from Hungary began to show up very easy to get across. They had no trouble going across the line. None of them. All just poured across by the thousands. In the Austrian refugee camps, you see our press in America break out in a virtual rage of glorification of the Hungarian freedom fighters, the refugees from the communists. Nobody stopped to ask why, during these first days when the communists had been defeated, or seemed to be, when the anti-communists were in control and looked like they were going to be able to maintain themselves for a few days, this is the very time when these people were going across the line. Why should the anti-communists be rushing across the line so frantically at that time? But they were all glorified as anti-communist refugees from the communist regime in Hungary, and these were the great freedom fighters, and we had to get them over here at once. So we not only started bringing them over, the President, Eisenhower, sent his personal plane to fly them over here. And they flew plane load after plane load in his own personal plane, bringing these people in. Well, of course, these were carefully selected communists who'd been selected and all of it planned before the revolt was even precipitated. Francis Walter was a good congressman and a great head of the HCUA, despite being a liberal and a socialist, proving they can be anti-communist. Very liberal left-winger in domestic affairs, economic affairs, and all of that. But he learned the dirt of the communists, and he was a very good anti-communist. Francis Walter himself said, and I have the newspaper headline quoting him exactly in great big headlines, that of the first 6,600 anti-communist refugees brought over here from the Hungarian revolt, many of them by our president's personal plane, that every single one of them was a communist, a hardcore communist. And what's more, they had all been given immigration numbers that belonged to somebody else and allowed to scatter through the country so there'd be no chance of ever sending them back. Now, this is from the head of the House Committee on Un-American Activities at that time. How many? My guess would be around 15,000 of these hardcore communists, carefully selected of the very best order for the communist purposes, were sent over here under the guise of being communist freedom fighters and turned loose in our country, and they are still here. And that is one reason, frankly, why we stay clear of involvement with Hungarian freedom fighters. There's plenty of good ones over here, but you never know when or where. Now, as the revolt lost and the youngsters were squelched and the tanks were sent in, it was all over, you then had some real anti-communists, those who'd hoped they were going to win, had really carried on this revolt, and they began to try to get out, and they were shot down like dogs in trying to get into the Austrian refugee camps across the border. But some did. And always in a case like that, there's a few did, and you can be sure if a few weren't able enough, determined enough, courageous enough, and persistent and hard enough to get through, the communists would have allowed them to. Let me remind you, the communists never want all black instrumentalities. They never want anything complete. They want to be able to argue about it, point out illustrations. So there were at least a few hundred very good anti-communist refugees from Hungary who in the latter part of this period of some 8 or 10 weeks, or 6 or 8 weeks, did get across to the Austrian refugee camps and were brought over here, many of them, and they're in this country too. So they can always be found and pointed to, but to show that this was a great humanitarian thing by our government to bring over these anti-communist refugees. As I say, at least 15,000 of them were carefully selected agents of the communist regime. Now this is one thing, one of the many things that the communists set out to accomplish through the Hungarian revolt. Another, of course, was the old standard purpose of all such maneuvers, and that was to destroy the resistance in Hungary, which was quite strong. The Hungarians have always been very patriotic, very brave, very courageous, was to destroy that resistance at a time when it was not only most convenient and safest for the communists, but would serve many other purposes too. And the best information I can get is that they destroyed the anti-communist resistance which was smoldering underground in Hungary so completely then it'll be 25 years before they'll have anything to worry about in Hungary again in that connection. But, ladies and gentlemen, they went further than that. They, as they usually do, they found ways to wring the last drop out of that lemon. The older people who had participated in the revolt and were caught were just killed at once. But the youngsters, the high school seniors, college freshmen, and so forth, 16 and 17 years old, who were caught, were not killed at once. They were put in prison. The excuse used was that they were guilty of high treason to the state, of course the communist state, but that's not the way they worded it, and that as youngsters they were not qualified to defend themselves from such a charge. So they should be allowed, for humanitarian reasons, this is how cruel the lies, the deceptions are, to wait until they had achieved their majority, till they were 21, before they were brought to trial for high treason. So they were kept in jail for that purpose. Now, human nature being what it is, if those youngsters had been killed at once, it would have been horrible, but the parents or uncles or aunts or nephews or friends that they had would presently begin to forget. In the course of a few months, they think back and they remember Mary and Sam, but life is going on, and Mary and Sam have been gone for 6 months, and it begins to lose its effect. But for 4 years, these youngsters were in prison with torture and death hanging over them, and their parents, their relatives, their cousins, their sweethearts are all aware all the time that Mary and Joe are still in this prison with this fate awaiting them, which is bound to come when they became 21. The deterrence against future revolt, the very thing the communists wanted, was made tremendously more powerful by this kind of cruelty and psychological cruelty. That's not all. They miss no possibility. The man who ordered the tanks into Budapest to squelch the revolt was Khrushchev. In August 1959, it was announced on the latter part of the last day of July that he would be coming here the middle of 15th of September. I remember those dates, but I had to stop and think of the year, and I should have had that right on the tip of my tongue. Anyway, he came over in the middle of September 59. And it was while he was here, we published the list. No trouble getting the names. The communists want these things known. Just like when the AFL published a list way back in 52 of the 14 million, they didn't publish the names, but published the amount, 14 million people the Chinese communists had already deliberately murdered. There was no trouble in getting the statistics. The Chinese themselves wanted them known. All you had to do was monitor their radios from Hong Kong and get hold of their little local releases and papers. So there was no trouble getting this. We published in American Opinion the names of about the first 55 or 60 of these youngsters who reached 21. And the thing is, they were brought out and executed for high treason against the communist state while Khrushchev was over here being entertained by Eisenhower, right at that time on purpose. You can imagine what that does to the anti-communist morale in Central Europe, to the people who would like to think that America would help them in some way against the communists and that they could depend on America. And here are these youngsters who had revolted in Budapest against the communists, whose revolt had been put down by the communist murderer Khrushchev, being executed for having done so while Khrushchev is the royally entertained guest of the President of the United States. Timing is always very important to them. They squeeze every ounce out of it. And this is one of the accomplishments of the Hungarian revolt. There were a number of others. It fitted beautifully. Now, the point I want to make is that these revolts all over the world have been fomented by the communists, planned by them, instigated, precipitated, and controlled by them in many cases. They must divide and keep conquered, precipitate them so they can destroy the opposition when it's safest and best. Because if by any miracle there were some way of having a simultaneous revolt, if through some miracle of communication You could have the Russians revolt with what they showed at Vorkuta in 1953, or the East Germans with the terrific skill and determination they showed in 53, and but for the fact that somebody there among them was stupid enough to tip off our government 24 hours ahead and let some people in our government know they were going to revolt so that the communists, the Russians, had 24 hours warning. There's no telling how far the East Germans would have got in that revolt. But anyway, if the East Germans should revolt with the skill and ability they showed in 53, the Hungarians and the Poles, with the determination and the bravery, especially on the part of the Hungarians, that they showed in 1956, and the Chinese, with the just volume of manpower and determination and disregard for their own lives that they show all the time. There have been all kinds of revolts in China you never even hear about. It's a long ways away, it's a long ways inside, and so forth and so on, but running up to 1 million people involved. If all of these people, through some miracle of communication, should revolt at once, all rise up at one time against the communists, even if they had nothing but sticks and stones and their hands to fight with, the lords of the Kremlin couldn't last 3 months, and they know it. They couldn't possibly last 3 months. The one nightmare they live with, the thing they fear, they must fear, is a simultaneous uprising of the enslaved peoples. And ladies and gentlemen, an all-out war would automatically be such a signal. You can't keep a Third World War unknown even behind the Iron Curtain or among the most enslaved peoples. And a Third World War, a breakout of a really honest war, would be an automatic signal to everybody in all of the satellite countries, everywhere behind the curtain, now or never. This is it. There are all kinds of them who are willing to give their lives for freedom if they see any chance to do so. Dick Hillis wrote that marvelous pamphlet, 800 million pray for war. And what he meant was that there are 800 million people today whose lives are perfectly hopeless. There's nothing they can do even by giving their lives to fight for freedom. But if there were a war, if war should come, they could throw themselves and their lives into it in a fight for freedom that would make it worthwhile. 800 million pray for war. And he's got a good point. Incidentally, did you know Dick Hillis by any chance, Doctor? He's headquarters in Manila, last I knew, but he's in Taipei a great deal, and in Los Angeles quite a bit. He's a wonderful missionary, head of a missionary group. And so you would have this now or never immediate feeling on the part of 800 million or 1 billion enslaved peoples, and they just couldn't last. So that is just one of the reasons. I took a long time to explain it because there were some other angles here that were worthwhile on their own. Why all this worry about Russian military might and threat to us as an actual honest attack of war is just nonsense. They attack us as anything like an honest war from the Russians, not a controlled brush fire Korea business or what we're going to have in Vietnam, somewhat bigger the way they are heading and planning, but a real war. Everybody in the world against the communists rises up. It's a signal. That's the last thing in the world they can possibly stand. Now to go back to Sputnik. Of course, the communists had many purposes in mind and gained many benefits from Sputnik, especially in the international arena. For one thing, it gave them a whole new level of scientific and technological prestige, however unearned that prestige may have been. Their launching of Sputnik put tremendously powerful ammunition into the hands of the Bertrand Russells and the Cyrus Edens and the Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy and other members of the Let's Surrender tribe. Sputnik enabled the Soviets' agents in the chancelleries of Western Europe and in our government greatly to increase the pressures on Adenauer in West Germany. And Sputnik did many other things for the communists. But by far the most important in their total plans, in my opinion, were the communist aims which had helped them to push forward so mightily right here in the United States. Now, we pointed out the 10 major purposes with regard to our domestic economy that the communists had in putting up their Sputnik in a long article in American Opinion published only about 3 or 4 months after Sputnik was launched. And by Sputnik I mean the first one. And ladies and gentlemen, we have not had to change a word in the substance of those 10 points. It was all perfectly obvious what they were trying to do with regard to our domestic economy. We haven't had to change a word, for you have already seen many of them happening or in the process of happening, and all of them being brought more closely upon us every day. This was a long-range plan, as I said, to drive America into a huge new jump into the socialist camp. Now, these aims were to have us carry out, one, greatly expanded government spending for everything that could possibly be associated with defense, for foreign aid, for every conceivable means of getting rid of ever larger sums of American money as wastefully as possible. Waste, unfortunately, sad to relate, has, of course, been one of the deliberate parts of the program for many reasons, to see how much American money could be wasted in carrying out these supposedly worthwhile programs, and even how ridiculously it could be wasted. You have to keep total communist purposes in mind to grasp that, but it's true. Some of the things with regard to warehouses of government equipment, armed uniforms and so forth, spending incredible amounts of money to carry in warehouses uniforms that will never be worn. Nobody ever expects them to be worn, and even other things that are worse. Two, higher and then much higher total taxes, including new forms of taxes wherever they could be devised and imposed. The idea has been not only to make taxes higher, but to have more taxes by different government agencies, find new kinds of taxes all of the time. You've seen it going on. Three, an increasingly unbalanced budget, despite the higher taxes. Now, you can see how far this program had gone even by 1958. From the fact that by about 60, the fact that our national debt, when it was supposed to be $250 billion, that was the admitted open debt, was just about $1 trillion. We published the figures on it, an article that was written for us by Medford Evans. We had it very carefully checked by Elizabeth Wilson, who's one of the best actuaries in the world, and by Walter Spar, who's known to many of you. We rewrote it, we sent it back, we rewrote it. We made very sure, we took about 6 months to be sure that article was right, which we showed that the government debt, the United States federal government debt, was actually about $1 trillion instead of the $250 million they were then admitting. And just a few months after we published that article, Maurice Stans, controller of the currency, came out in a speech and stated that the real actual debt of the United States, instead of the $250 billion they admitted, was at least over $750 billion. He got that close to admitting what we had proved in the article. Now, all this was part of a pattern of such incredible expansion of debt spending as to bring us further and further into the necessity and acceptance of complete government-run everything philosophy and action. 4, increasingly irresponsible inflation of our currency leading towards its ultimate worthlessness and repudiation. 5, government controls over prices, wages, and materials as rapidly as sufficient excuses could be developed, such as to combat inflation. You always get these more and more controls, of course, and all of this to combat inflation as one of the excuses. 6, greatly increased socialistic controls over every operation of our economy and every activity of our daily lives. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, this was published in 1958. You can find the magazine pointing out that this is what they were doing with Sputnik, planned to do. This was to be accompanied, naturally and automatically, by a correspondingly huge increase in the size of our bureaucracy, and in both the cost and reach of our domestic government. You've seen a parallel growth of the cost, how far it reaches into our lives, more and more all of the time. 7, far more centralization of power in Washington and the practical elimination of our state lines. There has been and is a huge and many-faceted drive going on gradually to reduce the significance of our state lines within the Union to no more than our county lines now mean within the states. There are many ways in which they approach that, and there are many other programs which have that as a partial purpose. Metro government, for one. Imagine if they could bring metro government to Cincinnati to the same extent they did to Dade County, Florida, when you've got 3 states involved right there in the area, what that does to state lines and the state authorities. There are many other places where they will try to use metro government. Urban renewal is being used for not only its own many purposes, partly as an incredible invitation to fraud and embezzlement and thievery, but also to help to break down state lines. 8, the steady advance of federal aid to and control over our educational system, leading eventually to complete federalization of our public education, which is, of course, their ultimate goal. 9, a constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of modern warfare and of the beauties and the absolute necessity of peace. Now remember what the communists mean by peace. They don't make any bones about it. Peace, this is all the word ever means to them, is a situation in which there is no opposition to communism. You can take the most idyllic island in the South Pacific where there hasn't been a fist fight in 50 years. That's not peace at all. Because if the communists sent a detachment in there, there would be resistance. There is only peace where there is no resistance to communism, and only complete peace, absolute peace, if all resistance is completely destroyed and there would be no resistance at all. Cuba is not quite a peaceful country yet because there's some resistance to Castro. Only if all of it is destroyed, all potential resistance is gone, then Cuba is at peace. And this is all, ladies and gentlemen, the communists mean by the word peace, or pretend to mean. They expect our people to understand something different. They expect the American people to go through all kinds of motions thinking along our lines. But that's all they're talking about. That's all they mean by peace. So, to go back, there's been a constant hammering into the American consciousness of the horror of modern warfare and of the beauties and the absolute necessity of, quote, peace, unquote. Peace always on communist terms, of course, and ultimately peace in the sense that the communists use the term, meaning a situation where all opposition to communism has been subdued. And 10, the consequent willingness of the American people to allow the steps of appeasement by our government which amount to a piecemeal surrender of the rest of the free world and of the United States itself to the Kremlin-ruled tyranny. Now, there, ladies and gentlemen, is what Sputnik and all of its side decorations were really about. If the communists could succeed, and goodness knows they have been doing so as rapidly as they expected, if the communists could succeed in making us domestically a communized nation, it will not be too difficult a final move, that's a little c there, communized nation, too difficult a final move for them to pull us right into the worldwide communist organization, there's a big C, communist organization ruled by the Kremlin. And unless we can have enough of an awakening in this country and enough of a rebellion against the appeasement policies of our government outside and its communizing policies inside America, the communists are going to succeed in accomplishing every one of these means to their final end and that final goal as well. Let me try to wind up this first part of the 7 parts of the total presentation, which is this negative one of the communist menace, by saying it in summary, ladies and gentlemen, of this part of the total, we are rapidly losing a Cold War in which our freedom, our country, and our very existence are at stake. And while we don't seem to know we are losing this war, you can be sure that the communists do. There's just one thing, only one thing in the whole world which the communists feared even in 1958, certainly the only thing which they fear today. It is that despite their tremendous influence in our government and over all of our means of mass communication, the American people will wake up too soon, might somehow be waked up too soon to what has really been happening and is now happening right under their very noses. The only thing which can possibly stop the communists, it's been the only thing for some years, is for the American people to learn the truth in time, or for enough of the American people to learn enough of the truth in time. It has been in order to contribute my small bit to such an awakening that I gave up my business responsibilities and income and any future I had in business in order, through my magazine and speeches first and then through the organization of the society, to try to do my part to bring some inkling of the truth to as many people as I can reach. Now, some people have interpreted that statement as sort of a plea on my part for applause or sympathy or something, for a sacrifice, and I can assure you that is ridiculous and completely wrong. I am like a man whose house is on fire, who's got 2 buckets, one in each hand, running as fast to the little stream as he can to fill the buckets full of water and bring them back to try to put the house out, and he's shouting to all of his neighbors, for goodness sakes, look what's happening, grab some buckets and help me. And nobody says about such a man, gee, isn't he a self-sacrificing character? He stopped weeding his roses to go get the water to put his house out. It's on fire. Well, that's exactly my motivation, what I'm trying to do. Now, I mentioned the fact that I did give up everything I'd planned for the latter part of my life to put my whole time in this fight, just for one reason, which is to show you people how deadly serious the situation appeared to me as far back as 1954. And it, of course, has become a great deal more serious since. Now, some of you may think I am an alarmist. Well, very frankly, I am. I have been for some years. For in my opinion, based on many years now of intensive study of the methods, the progress, and the menace of the communist conspiracy, there's ample reason for extreme alarm. And I'm hoping to make all of you even more alarmists than you may be today. It seems to me that all you need to cause you to share my alarm, my fears, and my determination is simply to get a map of the world, shade it up, study it carefully, look at the score, just see for yourself. After you've done that, the first thing for you to do as a newly awakened alarmist or more extreme alarmist is to become better informed about many things that we cannot cover here. One matter on which most Americans need to become better informed is what being subjugated by the communists, or, quote, arriving at an accommodation with communism, unquote, as they want it called, would really mean. A few years ago, my wife and I were walking along the Cam River in Cambridge, England, with friends of ours. He's a manufacturer in England. Very good friends of ours. It was about dusk and in a setting where you sort of think in centuries, terms of centuries instead of years. And he said to me, he said, Bob, look, I wish you wouldn't worry so about the communists. He said, I agree, they're going to take us over. He said, I would have thought it was crazy a few years ago to say that, but I've read enough of your stuff, and I'm convinced that you're right, they're going to take us over. But look, it's not going to be that bad. We'll find some way to get along with them. We'll arrive at some kind of an accommodation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's just incredible to have anybody believe that, because their cruelty and terrorism, especially after they've taken over, is almost beyond imagination. And the domination of our press, television, and radio by communist influences has been so great and is now so great that you simply are not allowed to learn or to be reminded of the real nature of the beast to whom we are losing. General Mark Clark, for instance, officially reported from Korea, quote, we obtained solid evidence that the communists slaughtered 11,622 members of my UN command while they were defenseless prisoners of war. These men were tied to their fellow prisoners and transported to previously selected sites. They were dumped alive into trenches dug for the purpose and summarily shot, unquote. Now, we know that in some cases, at least one case, they weren't even shot, weren't even given the coup de grace. They were just dumped alive into trenches and buried alive. And a huge majority of those 11,622 boys were sons and brothers, sweethearts and cousins of yours and of mine, boys from our hometowns. But how many of you ever saw that report by General Clark in your headlines or anywhere else? And incidentally, if you want more facts about it, buy his book, General Mark Clark's From the Yalu to the Danube. And you get all the specific report, the whole thing, including a lot more than I put down here, all in with an official report. During the so-called Spanish Civil War, and this was on the authority of the London Times, which then as now has certainly not been noted for its anti-communism, in one 12-month period, the communists murdered in cold blood more than 4,000 Catholic priests. This is back about 1936. And during that same period, they drove an even larger number of Catholic nuns out into the streets of the cities and towns of Spain, perpetrated incredible obscenities on them, and then killed the nuns. Now, these and similar epic cruelties of the period are facts documented beyond all question. But how many of you ever, even in this audience, have ever even heard of them? I have things here I would go into at more length, except that we used up the time, but let me stop to mention that during this period, Nehru, with his own people starving in India, was sending shiploads of food to the Spanish communists, the so-called lawyers, to La Pasionata, the famous woman communist leader. Another interesting part of the Spanish Civil War is that the man who made his reputation and fame and future by the atrocities committed on the priests and the nuns was a man named Alberto Bayo. Alberto Bayo then, when they lost the Civil War in Spain, went to Moscow and was trained by Moscow to train other guerrillas in cruelties and atrocities. And when Castro got ready to undertake his second effort to overthrow Batista and take over Cuba, the second one which was successful, got his $1 million in New York and began to train his 82 guerrillas, the man he used to train them in Mexico was Alberto Bayo, supplied him to Castro by the Kremlin to train the men that he took to Cuba. Yet this is the man people were trying to tell you wasn't a communist, couldn't possibly be. The leading paper in the Catholic press with over 900,000 circulation, our Sunday Visitor, had a man who week after week ridiculed me, made fun of me, how horrible it was to have this guy Welch, didn't know what he was talking about Castro being a communist, because he himself, Dale Francis, knew that Castro couldn't be a communist. He knew him real well. So the record was completely clear. And as I say, the man who trained Castro's 82 guerrillas was Alberto Bayo. And when Castro took over Cuba on the last night of the year, and then January 1, 1959, when he took over Havana, the first man he sent a telegram to come over and help him celebrate was Alberto Bayo. The record was so incredibly clear. But to go on, we were talking about cruelties here, which got me off because Bayo was the man who perpetrated so many of these cruelties in Spain at that time. The man who, up until not too many years before 1958, had for many years been holding the highest theoretical honor and office in the Soviet Union was Clemente Voroshilov, chairman of the Presidium, and generally accorded the exalted, though completely non-existent title of President of the Soviet Union. Of course, there is no such title, and he never was President of the Soviet Union, but that's what our people, our liberals, frequently called him. Now, when 11,000 Tsarist officers with their wives and children surrendered the city of Kiev on the solemn promise, a promise which had been advanced to them by Voroshilov to induce this surrender, that they would be allowed to disperse and go to their home. The minute they had put their arms down, the arms had been picked up, Voroshilov had all of the men and boys shot at once, not even a delay or nothing. And he put the women and girls into brothels for his army. And far from ever repenting of this supreme piece of barbarism, guys don't change, some 15 years later, Voroshilov boasted of it to American Ambassador William C. Bullitt as one of the glorious highlights of his career, how he had captured the city of Kiev without firing a shot, except those used to kill the defenders after they'd put down their arms. And when Bullitt couldn't take the part about the women without showing his disgust and worse, Voroshilov explained that the ambassador shouldn't feel that way with regard to his having used the women for his army's health, as he put it, instead of shooting them, because it didn't really matter, for they were all dead within 3 months anyway, so what difference did it make? Now, the record of Nikita Khrushchev was infinitely worse. Mass murders totaling some 12 million victims can be charged directly to his orders. Bulganin, Menshikov, and the others were exactly the same. So are the people running it today. No difference whatsoever. I could go on with specific and horrible illustrations literally for hours, and those illustrations could be picked out of the events taking place all around us right now. Probably the most massive and vicious cruelties ever inflicted on human beings were those at Hubei province, China, in around 1932 by the orders of Mao Zedong, just to terrorize the Chinese into appearing to support his civil war, his drive for their independence. Literally hundreds of thousands of Chinese peasants were killed in a period of a few months deliberately by the most horrible tortures imaginable because he wanted the terror to silence the others. And for the purpose of, as I said, terrorizing the natives into supporting his guerrilla communist insurrection and thus making it look like a civil war. The FLN did the same thing in Algeria. You had only a couple of years ago the same thing being done in Angola. You can go on as to what happened in Katanga when the United Nations sent its mercenaries in there when they were actually bombing ambulances as well as hospitals. You can go on to the cruel tortures being practiced deliberately for torture purposes in many parts of the world today. I'd like to go into some of the Sabsigun activities by Sukarno's crowd in the Moluccas, and all kinds of things, but I've got to skip it. I'm running over. The point of it all, ladies and gentlemen, is that this horror I have been talking about is not something happening on some other and far-off planet or perpetrated by the Assyrians 2,500 years ago, are dreamed up as the imaginative nightmare of an Edgar Allan Poe. These are the very real acts and deliberate policies of the recent past and the very present of people whom we treat as human beings and with whom we sit around conference tables and arrive at truce terms and concessions to appease them. Now, there are some 700 million non-Russian, non-communists now living daily lives of virtual slavery behind the Iron Curtain, some 40 million of them in the actual slave labor camps of Russia and Red China, who only a dozen years, or in some cases less, and in many, many cases less than 15 years ago, enjoyed practically the same personal freedoms as do you and I today. These people now say to each other, but above all to themselves, if I had only known. Talk to some of the Cuban refugees, the honest ones. We are loaded with the phonies, of course. Castro probably has more agents in Florida than there are police in Florida. But there's plenty of good ones. Talk to them about it. They now say to each other, but above all to themselves, if I had only known, if I had only believed, there is no amount of work and sacrifice and suffering I would not have given if I'd only realized the necessity, the danger in time. Now it is too late. And any amount of struggle and of sacrifice, even of life itself, is all in vain. Now, the number of people saying this, the number of people subject to the cruelties I've been talking about, is now increasing by tens of millions every year. And we are directly in the path of the conqueror, and in the path now pretty close in front. Are we really so hopelessly blind, stupefied by prosperity on one side and insidious propaganda on the other, that we cannot even see the wolves devouring the carcasses of our brothers or drawing ever nearer to ourselves? Are we going to let our country and our whole civilization go under and new dark ages of serfdom be ushered in while we listen to the tinkle of the cash register or happily play at our little games? I say, may God forbid, but may we speedily become more worthy that he should. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, I am practically through. I'm going to end this grim argument today on quite a religious note, the same note on which I used to end it when it was a speech of an hour and a half at night. You see how it's grown. And I always ended it on this note, the same one that I want to use now. For whether you believe it or not, and some of you do, and some partly, and some not quite, but whether you believe it or not, we are very far along in a gathering crisis that is going to make us all search deeply into our beliefs and into the values and loyalties that motivate our actions. This is a worldwide battle, the first in history of this kind that is worldwide, between light and darkness, between freedom and slavery, between the spirit of Christianity and the spirit of Antichrist for the souls and bodies of men. Let's win that battle by alertness, by determination, by courage, by an energizing realization of the danger, if we can. But let's win it even with our lives if the time comes when we must. Let's even keep in mind, against that time, an inspiration which we hope we shall not need. It comes from the end of a great and stirring hymn, written to inspire men to fight against a far less extensive slavery of their fellow men. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free while God is marching on. If the danger from this communist conspiracy were all we had to worry about, that would be enough. But every thinking and informed man senses that even as cunning, as ruthless, and as determined as are the activists, whom we call communists with a capital C, the conspiracy could never have reached its present extensiveness, and the gangsters at the head of it could never have reached their present power unless there were tremendous weaknesses in the whole body of our civilization. Weaknesses to make the advance of such a disease so rapid and its ravages so disastrous. And this feeling is easily confirmed by observation. But to analyze and understand these weaknesses, we have to go deeply into both the political history and the philosophical history of the human race. By your leave, or perhaps I should say without it, I'm going to attempt a brief analysis in that area. For we definitely need this understanding as background to the discussion of program and of action which will follow. Now, I'll keep this exploration from being dry and boring to the best of my ability, and I'll keep it as short as I well can. In my opinion, the first great basic weakness of the United States, and hence the chief reason for its susceptibility to the disease of collectivism, is simply the age of the Western European civilization. And I am not being cryptic, clever, nor facetious, as I hope soon to make clear. Some of you will already have recognized, in fact, that I am drawing a corollary to the conclusions set forth by Oswald Spengler. So let me put Spengler's theory in simple language as concisely as I can. Actually, as I know some of you are well aware, the cyclic theory of cultures has been advanced, or was advanced, by a large number of excellent scholars in the period from about 1890 to 1920, and one or two of them probably did a better job than Spengler. A man named Welch did probably the best job of all. But the whole theory has been so identified with Spengler's name that we might as well leave it that way for convenience. Oswald Spengler was a very learned but very conceited German who wrote a book which was first published in 1912, I believe, but first published in English in 1918, of which the English title was The Decline of the West. Some of you remember it as Der Untergang des Abendlandes, was the original German, because the title was widely used all over the world. A lot of the direct effectiveness of the book was spoiled by the almost nauseating displays of erudition in which it abounds. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once called it a marvelous humbug of a book, which description actually reveals more about that eternal sophomore, Holmes, than it does about the ostentatious scholar, Spengler. And despite the way that Spengler overplayed his hand and overproved his point, a rather strange thing happened. The so-called liberal scholars of the world completely demolished Spengler's arguments at once. And then they have kept right on, returning to the task and demolishing Spengler's thesis finally and for good every year or two for the past 40 years. In fact, Will Durant has made it clear that one of his great purposes in his life, as he gets towards the end, he thinks he has to take the time to do it specifically, is to offset and contradict Spengler. For the convincing way in which Spengler's explanation fits the known facts of human history just would not let his conclusion be downed and forgotten, any more than the convincing way in which Darwin's general theory fitted the known facts of animal life would let Darwin's theory be suppressed and ignored 2 generations earlier. Until at last the international socialists, somewhat in desperation, with the Fabians and Labour Party bosses in England taking the lead, made one grand and lasting effort to have Spengler discredited by being overshadowed. They took a meretricious hack named Arnold J. Toynbee, who just by the intrinsic evidence of his own pages is one of the worst charlatans that ever lived. They had Toynbee with all kinds of assistants they gave him. The rumor was he had 600 at one time, but I don't give you that as fact because I don't know. But they had Toynbee interpret and rewrite history in such fashion as specifically to supplant Spengler's cyclic theory of cultures with Toynbee's half-baked nonsense. And then the whole liberal establishment, especially of England and America, gave Toynbee such favorable publicity and such a terrific build-up as no other historian, not even the socialist H.G. Wells, has ever enjoyed before. The result has been that today at least 1,000 people are familiar with Toynbee's history and have even read a few pages of it, to each one who has read Spengler and knows what he tried to say. Now, those who are familiar with the way in which Stalin won out in his contest with Trotsky in the years 1924 to 1929 will recognize the similarity of the technique used. It's an old and favorite technique with the communists and their liberal dupes and allies. Stalin, who was in complete charge of all media of communication in Russia during those years, never actually suppressed, nor even refused to allow to be published any pamphlets by or favorable to Trotsky. He merely held the press run and distribution of all such pamphlets down to a few thousand, on the grounds that the demand didn't justify anymore, while pamphlets by himself or others condemning Trotsky were printed and distributed in huge quantities all over Russia. Now, as I say, this technique is widely used. One fairly recent illustration, quite typical of this communist technique, was used by the Fund for the Republic when they printed and distributed 35,000 copies of Irving Griswold's straining pedantry in defense of the Fifth Amendment pleaders, and then printed and distributed 1,000 copies of Dickerman Williams's answer to Griswold's nonsense in order to show how fair-minded they were, and made quite a lot of publicity out of it. And somebody else had to dig out the fact and throw it in their face that they'd put out 35,000 copies of one and 1,000 copies of the other. And you should have seen the double talk that Irving Griswold then gave in letters in reply to comments based on that. There's really something. But that's getting off the track, which is that due to all of this huge buildup of Arnold Toynbee as a philosopher-historian, almost any American or Englishman who happened to take a notion for some reason to go digging into world history from a philosophical viewpoint, or just from sheer curiosity, would certainly turn to Toynbee, would never have heard of Spengler, and hence would have no chance to learn Spengler's ideas. And all of this introduction to those ideas has not been wasted, I hope, for it does emphasize this fact. Spengler's theory is absolutely fatal to the acceptance of socialism or any form of collectivism as a forward step or as a form of progress in man's sociological arrangements. For in Spengler's view, collectivism is a disease of society, concomitant with decay and remarkably similar to cancer in the individual. Now, basically, when you dig through the chaff and the dressing in Spengler enough to get at his thought, he held that a societal development, which we ordinarily classify as a civilization, is an organic culture which goes through a life cycle just the same as any of the individual organisms which we see whole and with which we are more familiar. Now, it's been many years since I have read Spengler, so I do not know how far I am wandering from his own specific or exact thinking in trying to present his central theme. There is certainly more Welch than there is Spengler in what follows. But the easiest way to make the theme clear is to illustrate the life of a civilization as a parallel to the life of an individual man. You then find that of the some 21 or 22 civilizations which we know enough about to discuss intelligently, some were struck down while in middle age and reasonable health by an enemy, as was the Neo-Babylonian civilization by Cyrus and Darius, for instance. Just the same as an individual man might be shot by an enemy or run over by a streetcar. Another civilization, like the Carthaginian, never was able to attain its full normal growth and strength because of the overwhelming competition for sustenance and Lebensraum of a too close, too powerful, and too greedy a rival, namely Rome, which must have been the case for many a man in the barbarian settings of our evolution. And another civilization, like the Assyrian, could almost be said to have died of a heart attack. It went to pieces so suddenly and so completely in the middle stage of an apparently successful and healthy existence. There were factors of weakness inside the body which caused it to drop almost exactly like a man whose heart suddenly kicks up and then quits altogether 20 minutes later. The real point, however, is this. An individual human being may die of any number of causes, but if he escapes the fortuitous diseases, does not meet with any fatal accident, does not starve to death, does not have his heart give out, but lives in normal health to his 70 years and 10 and then keeps on living, if he escapes or survives everything else and keeps on doing so, he will eventually succumb to the degenerative disease of cancer. For death must come, and cancer is merely death coming by stages instead of all at once. And exactly the same thing seems to be true of those organic aggregations of human beings which we call cultures or civilizations. The individual cells in a human body die and are replaced by new ones constantly. Only when and where cancer attacks a part of the body are the dead ones not replaced by new cells which contribute their share of strength to the body as a whole. Now, the individual human beings in an organic culture die and are replaced constantly by new ones. But even if the culture escapes enemy conquest and accidents of nature and starvation and all of the fortuitous diseases, such as the internal bleeding which almost destroyed Europe at the time of the Reformation and the 30 Years' War, death will still come eventually, and usually a lingering death, through the degenerative disease of collectivism. For collectivism destroys the value to the organism of the individual cells, that is, the individual human beings, without replacing them with new ones with new strength. The Roman Empire of the West, for instance, started dying from the cancer of collectivism from the time Diocletian imposed on it his New Deal. And while it was given the coup de grace by the barbarians 175 years later, it had already been so weakened by this cancer that the city of Rome itself had been an easy prey to Alaric more than 60 years before its final fall. Now, how really exact or how valid this parallel between the lives of human individuals and the lives of their well-integrated aggregations may be, I don't know. I certainly do not have either the knowledge or the inclination to support whatever belief Spengler may have had and appeared to have, that there was actually a biological compulsion for a social organism to follow a life cycle similar to that of the individual. But no such rigid crystallization of the thought is at all necessary. For whether fatalistically determined by biological principles or not, there is an analogy between the two which is inescapable. And even if it is nothing more than a useful analogy, subject to all of the flaws and possible exceptions which may mar any analogy, it leads automatically to conclusions which are devastating to socialist theory. For it is perfectly evident, right in the cases of the very civilizations that we know most about, that both the Greek and the Roman civilizations did perish of the cancer of collectivism, and that the civilization of Western Europe is doing so today. Now, it is even possible to establish a fairly accurate time ratio for this analogy or parallel. It runs about 20 to 1. In other words, a civilization 1,400 years old would be at the physical stage in its life cycle, roughly, of a man of 70. And with that yardstick in mind, we can now come at last to take the look at Western Europe, which I have been trying to make worthwhile. And after that, the look at America, which is the real goal of all this preparation. The civilization of Western Europe arose out of the ashes of the Roman Empire of the West. If we try to establish any approximation to a birth date, the analogy becomes sloppy. For actually the parallel is much closer to that of an oak tree which has been felled, but which still scatters acorns that sprout long afterwards. But if we still stick to the analogy of a man, nevertheless, we might consider that after a long gestation period, an entity which could eventually become Western European civilization was born in the time of Charlemagne. The boy had reached the strutting, stick-throwing stage at the time of the Crusades, the stage of growing intellectual curiosity in the Renaissance, the stage of youthful adventure in the ocean explorations of the 15th century. And then there followed 3 centuries, or the equivalent of 15 years for a man, of the most solid accomplishments of a hard-working, hard-thinking middle age. Now, none of these comparisons will quite hold water, and I don't know whether Spengler could have postulated some that would or not. But after all shortcomings of the allegory are recognized, the fact remains that Western Europe of the last half of the 19th century was remarkably similar to a man of some 65 years of age who had led an extremely busy life of great stresses and strains, but an extremely successful life, nevertheless, of mental growth, physical accomplishments, and material acquisitions. The old man, Western Europe, had weathered every danger, had stood all the bludgeonings of fate, and had come out at that age with a tremendous accumulation of knowledge, experience, material possessions, and prestige among his neighbors, the other civilizations or societal organizations of the rest of the planet. In fact, in my amateurish opinion, the last half of the 19th century AD, like the first half of the 6th century BC before it, was the high watermark up to its time of human civilization, accomplishment, and hope for the future. And it was Western Europe which made that last half of the 19th century the period of the highest level to which man has yet climbed in his struggle to reach an enlightened and humane life. But, as so often happens for the individual, by the time Western Europe had the knowledge, the wealth, and the ability to get the most out of life, it was ready to die. The truth is that, by a cycle which seems inevitable, whether it is a biological reality or only an analogy, Western Europe was worn out. And under those circumstances, the degenerative disease of collectivism, the cancer of social organizations, began its peripheral infiltration. Now, not only the early beginnings of this disease, but the certainty of its slowly increasing ravages and the eventual fatal effect of its ultimately advanced stages were clearly visible to a number of scholars and philosophers in the middle of the century. Bastiat in France was quite aware of what was happening, and especially was Herbert Spencer. The whole picture for 100 years ahead was quite visible to the genius of Herbert Spencer as early as the middle of the 19th century. As a matter of fact, he coined one epigram that sums the whole picture up about as concisely as you could possibly do with regard to welfarism, statism, socialism, whatever you want to call it. He said, the ultimate result of protecting fools from their own folly is to fill the planet full of fools. Now, he's thinking biologically and also sociologically there. It's true in both cases. We could all pick up illustrations. I didn't even mean to get into this, but it occurred to me. I have a friend, he's well known to several others of you here too, who owns quite a nice home down off the Susquehanna River in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it's an old place. The name of the home is the Fallen Arches, I believe he calls it, because of the way it's put together. But anyway, he has a nice stretch of white, flat land out there between himself and the river. And some 15 years ago, he got the bright idea. He's exactly where the ducks go, south. They fly over going south in the fall, and they fly over coming back north in the spring. He got the bright idea of sprinkling some corn out on that white flat ground, and sure enough, in time a few ducks came down and scooped up the corn and went on. And then a few more came, and in the spring a few more, and next fall a few more. To make this story as short as I can, in the course of about 2 or 3 years, a couple of them stayed. And by the next spring, why, a few more stayed. And by that fall, a few more stayed. And this man, the last I knew, had 200 or 300 ducks that were going to starve to death if he didn't keep feeding them all the year around. And if you went on protecting these ducks from their own folly, you'd fill the whole planet full of ducks in time. And the same thing is true with regard to human beings and everything else that needs to be protected or wants to be. So Spencer summed it all up, that the ultimate result of protecting fools from their own folly, which is exactly what statism and welfarism tries to do, is and will be to fill the planet full of fools. But despite this being clearly seen by people like Bastian, Spencer, and others, the disease went right on. Digging into the body of Western European civilization. And by the time Bismarck, forming that alliance of the autocratic top of society with the greedy masses at the bottom, which has been so commonplace in history, began to crystallize the nebulous theories of the Marxists and other modern socialists into the welfare legislation of Germany of the 1880s, by that time the disease was starting to eat its way further into the body in disastrous fashion. Its ravages continued, increased, and spread until today Western Europe is so sick and weakened from the collectivism in its body and in its veins that it can never recover. Now, when an individual is dying of cancer, unless it is one of these very rare, rapid-acting forms of cancer, actually there come times when there seems to be some improvement, apparent recovery, a starting of recovery. Also, during the whole 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years it may take for an individual to die of a normal form of cancer, the organs that are not affected become stronger. They have to carry a larger part of the load of the body, and they actually, therefore, become stronger than they were before. You see the same thing happening. You see it in Western Europe. Germany actually has become somewhat stronger and is carrying a larger part of its load because the whole Western European civilization is slowly, gradually dying of cancer. And there are periods when it looks like, well, maybe it isn't quite so bad and it may last or recover. But there again, it's merely a deceptive temporary effect. So what I've been saying about Europe dying of the cancer of collectivism does not mean that in the normal course of events, Europe itself will soon become a desolate waste, while the monuments of its former kings lie toppled and forgotten, where in Shelley's famous line, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Not at all. Even hundreds of years after the fall of the Assyrian, Neo-Babylonian, and Persian civilizations in the Tigris-Euphrates stretches of Western Asia, the subjects of the Sassanid dynasty and other lesser offsprings of those once great civilizations still led lives that were perhaps happy and that certainly were important to themselves. But this does mean that the entity which was Western Europe, the social organism which was so closely knit and so well integrated, despite its national boundaries, languages, and jealousies, the Western Europe whose parts were so intertwined that Napoleon of France could marry the daughter of the Emperor of Austria as a means of helping one of his brothers to rule Spain and another brother to rule Holland, the Western Europe which could spare the strength to spread its pioneers, to colonize the uninhabited lands, and its Puka Sahibs to bring civilized rule to the settled natives on all the continents of the earth. That Western Europe of the 19th century can never come back. Yesterday we saw how it was actually pulling in, giving up its possessions without a fight. Emerson's son once ran across an unfinished poem of his father's that his father obviously was working on, and the poem began, "It is time to take in sail." And his son was so amazed that his father was thinking that he, the father, had become so old that it was time to take in sail, which Emerson did. He went on and wrote the poem. It's in his works. Well, Western Europe has been taking in sail for 50 or 60 years, very disastrously, in fact, with respect to the natives of so much of the world for which these European powers were responsible. all, as I pointed out yesterday, except Portugal, have given up their responsibility, have failed to live up to it, have allowed the natives for whom they were responsible to be turned over to the cruelties of the communists. But the point involved here is that it has been giving up its possessions and the things it had acquired and accomplished, letting them go to ruin, pulling in entirely. And that pulling in, giving up, getting too old, is going on as a part of the very fact of Western Europe all the time. It is either dying before our eyes or is already dead. For the vigor of its muscles and the strength of its whole body have been sapped beyond recovery by the cancer of collectivism. Now, lest I seem to be putting too much dependence in an analogy which is full of holes, let me just very briefly make a more matter-of-fact approach towards the same conclusion. For regardless of any organic cycle which may be involved, it is perfectly visible and incontrovertible that the rugged pioneer settlers of a new land want as little government as possible, always. That as the new society becomes more and more settled, as population grows, as commerce and or industry increase, as the society grows older, more and more government creeps in. And then, because demagogues find it to their personal advantage, they use trickery, persuasion, and bribery of the people with the people's own money to make the rate of increase in the quantity and reach of government far greater than the rate of increase in either the population or the justifiable need for government. So that by the time any society which has been so originated and fashioned, and it's amazing how many have been started just that way, by the time any such society has reached a thick population, comparative wealth, and considerable age, enough government has already been imposed on the people to constitute the beginnings of collectivism. This happened to the people who settled the islands and founded the city-states of Greece. It happened to their descendants who settled the Italian peninsula and founded the Roman Empire. It happened to their spiritual descendants who built the Western European civilization. And it is certainly happening to their descendants who founded and have built the American Republic. Now, with the next inevitable stage, after advanced collectivism has destroyed the vigor of any such society, which is its breakup into feudal units and the accompanying serfdom, we are not concerned here today. But let me pause to remind you that one of the great books of our time has been written on that subject. And if any of you people have college-age youngsters that are inclined to swallow some of the liberal nonsense that's being given to them, and you have difficulty getting them to read some of the books they ought to get a broader background, let me recommend one book that almost any intelligent youngster will read because it is obviously so brilliant from the beginning, so well written, such epigrammatic style, and is still one of the greatest books of the century. That's Friedrich Hayek's, H-A-Y-E-K, most of you know Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. The point of that book is that we are heading inevitably into a breakup of the dictatorship, which will come in between, exactly as followed the Roman Empire, into various feudal enclaves and the serfdom that goes with it. And he's absolutely right. Unless we stop the ultimate achievement of the complete dictatorship, there is bound to be the breakup into those feudal units that follow. The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. It's a great book, and it's a particularly useful book for the purpose that I mentioned. But we are not concerned with that further development here at all. What we are concerned with is the time usually involved in these successive developments. It is this question of the speed of the movement around the arc from pioneer to serf, or of the various stages of this movement to which this whole present discussion has been leading. And purely for the sake of simplicity and clarity, I hope you will let me go back to my analogy, even if you now regard it only as a figure of speech. For the whole point is that the Greek civilization was at least many centuries old. That is, many centuries removed from its pioneer days, before Pericles started it on the road to death at the very height of its glory, through making the government increasingly responsible for its citizens, instead of its citizens being responsible for and watchdogs over their government. Rome was already over 1,000 years from the days of Romulus and Remus, when Diocletian's reign signalized the advance of collectivism beyond the point of any possible recovery. Western Europe was, by a most conservative method of figuring its age, at least 11 to 1,200 years old before the disease of collectivism began to bring it to its deathbed. Or we even know enough today to go back in the other direction, where we find that the first Babylonian civilization also was at least 1,000 years old before collectivism had become sufficiently prevalent for Hammurabi to formalize it as the New Deal of his era. Now, in view of all of that, let's take a look at what has happened to America. It's true that the same thing has also happened to most of the other former British colonies, such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, but that's not our concern here. There was a little more justification for it anyway in those cases because they remained more closely tied to England. But the United States was not only a new and completely independent country, it was by any measure of appraisal the seat of a whole new civilization. There are few parallels in history more striking than the way Italy was settled by Greek pioneers who came over the sea, the Adriatic or the Mediterranean, depending on the direction in which they came, who came over the seas, took over the land from the Aborigines already there, and developed the new nation and new civilization of Rome, and the way America was settled by pioneers from Western Europe who came over the seas and took over from the natives already here and developed a new nation and a new civilization on this continent. The parallels are extremely close. In its earlier centuries, America not only did not regard itself as a part of the European organism at all, and if you want to see curiosity as to how much it resented it, read what happened to James Fenimore Cooper, who of course was regarded as one of our great novelists when he came back from Europe and he started trying to act European a bit and talk about if America could only grow up and get good manners, could really be a worthy part of the European family. And he almost got intellectually lynched, or literarily lynched for it. But anyway, the point I want to make is that in its earliest centuries, America not only did not regard itself as a part of the European organism at all, but became fiercely proud of its differences from Europe, its separation from Europe, and of its indigenously vigorous customs, culture, and destiny of its own. The American civilization was every bit as much of an entirely new and different civilization from the old and ancestral one of Western Europe as was Rome, a new civilization distinct from Greece. And this American civilization at the turn of the present century was only 300 years old. It had the strength and vigor and promise of a healthy young man in his late teens. There was no reason on earth for any such organism to be attacked by and start succumbing to the cancerous disease of collectivism at that stage of its young manhood, with its whole lifespan of accomplishment before it. And any of the natural or fortuitous attempts of the disease to get a foothold in the American social body, such as the virus implanted by Edward Bellamy with his Looking Backward, or by Upton Sinclair with his Jungle, or even the more pretentious concoctions of Thorstein Veblen, they would all have been so easily repulsed by the strong and growing organism that none of them would have left even a scar. But we have the cancerous disease of collectivism firmly implanted now. Nevertheless, we have people, more and more people, every day, feeling that nothing should be done by them, but everything for them by the government. The disastrous ravages of this disease are quite far advanced. And we have it basically because of too long and too close an association with a parent that was dying of this disease. A parent that was old enough and weakened enough for the virus to be rampantly active throughout the parent's whole environment. When Woodrow Wilson, cajoled and guided even then by the collectivists of Europe, took us into the First World War, while solemnly swearing that he would never do so, he did much more than end America's great period of happy and wholesome independence of Europe. He put his healthy young country in the same house and for a while in the same bed with this parent who was already yielding to the collectivist cancer. We never got out of that house again. We were once more put back even in the same bed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, also while lying in his teeth about his intentions, and we have never been able to get out of that bed since. In the meantime, the closer our relationship with this parent civilization has become, and the more exposed to the unhealthy air and the raging virus of the sick room we have been, the sicker and more morbidly diseased has the patient become. Until now, there is a tremendous question whether, even if we did not have the communist conspirators deliberately helping to spread the virus for their own purposes, we could recover from just the natural demagogue-fed spread of that virus when it is already so far advanced. With the communists skillfully using and encouraging this disease of collectivism as a means of weakening us, the outlook leads ever more irresistibly to despondency and despair. And we simply cannot overlook or underrate the prevalence of this disease in our vitals, entirely aside from the way the communists agitate the affected parts and make the disease worse, in any sound thinking or constructive plans for the future of America. But if I thought all hope were gone, I wouldn't be here, and neither would you. Let's leave the communist disease carriers out of the picture for a minute. I knew a man who, when he was around 50, and still otherwise a very healthy 50, was found by the doctors to have cancer already far advanced in one side of his jaw. They took that side of his jaw and practically half of his face right away from him at once. And when I first got to know him, at least 10 years later, he had a very peculiar-looking face, it is true. But otherwise, he was a grand example of both mental and physical health for a man of 60 to 65 years, and he was very happily teaching his lifetime subject as a professor at one of our most famous universities. Now, probably all of you have known somewhat similar cases, and it is certain that in those very rare cases where a healthy young man of 25 does in some way contract cancer, a sufficiently accurate diagnosis and sufficiently drastic surgery can restore him to health and enable him to go on and live out a normal, active, successful, and happy life. But it cannot be done by half measures. Now, what I've been trying so long and so hard to say comes to this. We have got to stop the communists for many reasons. One reason is to keep them from agitating our cancerous tissues, reimplanting the virus, and working to spread it so that we never have any chance of recovery. And stopping the communists is the most urgently important task before us, and we're going to be talking about it plenty. But even in stopping them, or in our efforts to do so, we cannot forget for a minute the disease which has helped them so much to go so far and to weaken us to such an extent and to become so dangerous to us. Nor can we forget for a minute the imperative need of excising and stopping the disease itself while we are stopping and after we have stopped the communists, or we shall merely die a somewhat slower and more lingering national death than if we let the communists destroy us in the first place. Push the communists back. Get out of the bed of a Europe that is dying with this cancer of collectivism, and breathe our own healthy air of opportunity, enterprise, and freedom. Then the cancer we already have, even though it is of considerable growth, can be cut out. And despite the bad scars and the loss of some muscles, this young, strong, great new nation, restored to vigor, courage, ambition, and self-confidence, can still go ahead to fulfill its great destiny and to become an even more glorious example for all the earth than it ever was before. It should be centuries from now before the natural time comes for the decline of America and for the highest torch of civilization to be taken over by the then rising newer nations to the west. But we do have to achieve the sufficiently drastic surgery, and that, of course, is a Herculean task. We shall return to a study of it when we come to the positive part of this program a little later. We pause just a minute, and sometimes where there's no chance for questions and answers at all, and I have to go right steadily talking and throwing at my friends some pretty compacted thoughts, I have a minute's break between a section which I call the intellectual cigarette. The thought is what the wine tasters do. You know, the professional wine tasters will take a sip of the wine they're evaluating, and then they'll take a puff on a cigarette to get that taste out before the next one, so that they are not influenced in the next taste by the last one. At least so I have heard. I am not a wine taster. That is a professional wine taster, you understand. But I've been told that that is the way they do. So I have wanted some intellectual cigarettes to go in between two sections which were as different as the one that we have just had and the one we're going to have next, and I've developed a number of them, and my wife won't let me tell them. So I haven't helped too much. But I have one we just take a minute with about the Indian with the best memory in the world. And the Santa Fe chief, many of you have ridden it from Chicago to Los Angeles, stops at Albuquerque where there's a long, high platform, a great long one. And the train pulls up alongside it. Well, anyway, this one did, and this passenger got out to stretch his legs, and he has another passenger walking up and down too, and the other passenger, passenger B, falls in step with passenger A, and he says, see way down the end of the platform, right at the end, that old Indian sitting there with the blankets and the beads? And passenger A says, yes. He said, well, that man, that old Indian, probably has the best memory of any human being that ever lived. His memory is a miracle. It's incredible. And passenger A says, what? You don't mean it? Passenger B said, I sure do. He's got a memory that's just unbelievable. It's a miracle. So passenger A said, well, that's something. So he walked on. Passenger B turned back, and he went all the way down to the end of the platform, and he walked up to the Indian. The Indian looked up at him, and the passenger says, what did you have for breakfast on July 7, 1943? The Indian paused just for a second and said, eggs. And the passenger thought, oh, for crying out loud, everybody has eggs for breakfast. What a fraud, what a phony. And he turned on his heels and walked back, got back and got on his car, went on to Los Angeles, forgot all about it, went about his business and went back and completely slipped his mind. 7 years later, he's on the train from Chicago to Los Angeles, the Santa Fe chief. It stops at Albuquerque, and he gets off to stretch his legs, and just happens to look up and look way down, and sure enough, way down the end of the platform is that same old Indian sitting there with the beads and the blankets, and he thinks, well, I'll be darned. The old fraud is still there. I don't mind. I have nothing against him. If that's the way he can make his living, helps him to sell his beads and his blankets, why not? I don't have anything against him at all. In fact, I think I'll walk all the way down and be sociable and say hello to him. So he walks all the way down the platform, walks up to the Indian. He says, how? The Indian says, scrambled. You don't sound like you believe it, Mr. Kevin.